If you ever opened up a synthesizer plugin in Logic, it probably looks something like this, and that is not user-friendly at all, at least upon first glance. But I guarantee you it's not as complicated as it looks. You really just need to understand four things to understand how a synthesizer works. To understand these four things, we'll be using RetroSynth in Logic, which has a much friendlier interface than the ES2 synthesizer. First, we need to understand how a synthesizer creates its sound. It does so through the use of oscillators, which create waveforms. So if we create a new MIDI track in Logic, and we come down to Instrument, we'll select RetroSynth, Stereo, and this interface is going to pop up. Now, the first thing we'll do, let's turn off this filter. Now, to change the waveforms for each oscillator, we have these knobs for shape 1 and shape 2. The picture is a different waveform. So this more zigzag one is white noise. This one right here is a triangle wave. And these rectangular looking ones are square waves. So let's hear what the square wave sounds like. And this arch right here is just a different type of square wave. So it could be tighter or it could be wider. Now this lever over here can bring in more of oscillator 1 or more of oscillator 2. For right now, let's set it to only hearing oscillator 1. If it was at 50, we'd hear an equal amount of oscillator 1 and oscillator 2. Let's set it to oscillator 1 for the current moment. So now, all we hear is that square wave. If we set it to oscillator 2, we're going to hear shape 2, which is set to a triangle wave. It's like a different timbre, right? Let's set it to be equally mixed. And we've created our first sound, which is a square wave and a triangle wave put together. Now, one thing we could do, let's bring it back to oscillator 2. We have semitones and synths. So this detunes the pitch of shape 2. Now we could do so with actual semitones, or we could do so with synths. So one is a little more fine, one is coarse. Let's bring shape 2 down a whole octave, which is 12 semitones. And let's detune it by about 20 cents. Now let's bring that back into the full mix. So let's have oscillator 1 and oscillator 2 playing at the same time. Right, so now we have a sound. This is the beginning of the sound design. And I'm using a keyboard. If you're not aware, you can press Command K and your computer keyboard will now act as a MIDI keyboard. Next, we need to understand the filter. Now, it's exactly how it sounds. This filter will process the sound that you've created with the oscillators, and it will cut off either the low frequencies or the higher frequencies. Or in some cases, it can cut off both low and high frequencies. Let's turn the filter back on. We have an LP filter, which stands for low pass. And what that's going to do is exactly how it sounds. It's going to let all the low frequencies pass through, and it's going to cut off the high frequencies. Now, the rate at which it cuts off is represented by this slope right here. So we could imagine all the high frequencies existing in the right side of this table, and low frequencies existing in the left side. So this slope is going to cut off the frequencies starting at this point and at a slope like that. And this line is representing all the low frequencies which are being allowed through the filter. Let's hear what it sounds like now with the filter on. So we lose a lot of the grit and the crispiness and whatever else you want to say, the brightness, because the high frequencies are not being allowed through the filter. We can change this by allowing more of the high frequencies through. Let's move this dot a little bit more to the right. So it's not as bright without the filter, but it still has a little bit of the grit to it, and that's what I'm looking for right now, making the sound. There's some more components to the filters. As you see, there's more knobs than what we've messed around with, but that gets a little more complicated, and for basic fundamental sound design, we don't really need that. If we're looking for a grittier sound, we'll allow in more high frequencies. If we want a cleaner or warmer sound, we'll allow in less high frequencies. could do the exact opposite. If we only want to allow through high frequencies, well, we just have to flip the table. So now the cutoff is cutting off the left side of the table, which are the low frequencies, and allowing through the high frequencies on the right side. And we lose a lot of the bass in that. Let's put it back to the low pass filter. Let's set it to an even 0.5. So again, our sound is starting to develop. Now we need to understand something called envelopes, which use the letters A, D, S, R. So the A stands for attack. So that is the amount of time it will take for the sound to begin after I click the key on whether it's the keyboard on the computer or an actual MIDI controller. If we set it to 1,000 milliseconds, actually let's do 2,000 milliseconds. It will take 2,000 milliseconds for the sound to reach its peak volume after I press the key. Let's hear what that sounds like. So you can see how it slowly rises up. And that's represented by these lines. So the attack rises up to this dot. Now we have D, which stands for decay. This is telling us how long it will take for the sound after peak to decay to a sustained value, which is what S stands for, sustain. At what value is our synthesizer going to sustain its pitch? So we could set that to 0.4. Let's go with 0.4. And it'll take let's do 9,000 milliseconds to decay to, of course it's going to do it by 200. So we'll do 9,100 to a level of 0.38. So this is meaning we have our peak, and it will take 9,000 milliseconds to decay to this value of 0.38 of the peak. Now the release tells us how long the sound will last after we lift our fingers off the keyboard or take our fingers off of the computer keyboard. So let's set this to 2,000 milliseconds as well. Now let's hear what our sound sounds like. So it should grow and then decay, sustain for however long I hold down the keys, and then when I release, there should be a little bit of a tail to it. Let's hear what that sounds like. So you could hear the sound slowly die out. Now we also have an envelope for the filter. This might get a little complicated, but A, D, S, and R stand for the same exact thing, except it's relating to the opening and closing of the filter. So the filter, when the attack is at 0 milliseconds, that means the filter happens right away. We have a low pass filter, so it filters out the high frequencies immediately. So this knob up here is telling us we want all of the filter's control to be controlled by the envelope. Let's do the same thing. So let's have it slowly open, decay to a value of, let's do 0.14, and a release comparable to the amplitude envelope. Let's see what that sounds like. So it's allowing in higher frequencies. Then it decays, which means it's closing again, which is cutting out the high frequencies. So you're able to hear a brightness gradually occur, and then it decayed down to a warmer sound. And then of course when I lift my hands off, the whole thing dies out. So that's how the envelopes work with volume, but it also works with the filter. Lastly, all synthesizers use something called an LFO. Now that stands for low frequency oscillator. Now there's another thing that can affect the filter, and that is the LFO. So this is something that's just constantly running on the synthesizer, but it's not actually something we'd hear. The frequency is too low. But it can be set to specific parameters and affect other mechanisms of the synthesizer. So let's go back to this knob and have the filter be fully affected by the LFO, which is what it means to be at 1. And the LFO can have different shapes. So if we give it a square wave shape, it will take on that characteristic, right? So in this case, since it's affecting the filter will open and then it will close. It'll open and close. If we had a triangle wave, it would gradually open and then immediately close. Gradually open, immediately close. So let's hear the square wave and how that's going to affect the sound when the parameter is set to the filter. So as you can see, when we have the filter being affected by the envelope and the LFO, our sound is constantly evolving. And this is what we want. In sound design, we might want a sound to stay the same the whole time, which is rather simple. And then we put some effects over it, maybe for a lead synth or a textural synth, maybe, who knows? It depends on what you want. Sometimes we want that sound to evolve for the entire length that we hold down the keys. And right now, that's what we're doing with our sound design. We have the LFO doing one thing with the filter, and the envelope doing another thing with the filter. We have our amplitude being affected by an envelope, and the actual waveforms themselves are creating a unique sound. And there's so much more that we could do with a more complicated synthesizer. And even this one has a couple of cool features, but this isn't a video about the synthesizer, it's about understanding the basics. And right there are our basics. We have the sound itself, so the oscillators, the frequencies that will be cut off from that sound, so a high pass filter, low pass filter, band pass, right? The envelopes affecting amplitude and the filter, and then the LFO, which in this case we're using to affect the filter, but the LFO can affect anything that the synthesizer allows it to be set to. So let's hear this sound with just simple chord progression. Just like that, we have a sound. It's unique, it has its own characteristic, and we can write a song using that sound. Hopefully this video had enough information so that you could get into sound design yourself, and I'll be doing a lot more sound design on this channel as well, so stay tuned for that. There's going to be more of this coming, and we're going to be going through all of the Logic plugins, so we'll have some fun making some sounds. I have a podcast every Monday talking about some fun music things, so be sure to check that out. Thanks for watching.